So this is a movie that I've gotten requests to do for years, but I've kind of held away from it because so many other people have already talked about it that I feel there's not much else I could add. But hey, might as well do it. It's been requested a lot, and I actually do quite like this movie, so let's take a look at it. This is the German animated movie Felidae. Felidae being Latin for feline. It's a noir-style detective-ish story, but most of the cast is anthropomorphized cats, and even then they're only anthropomorphized in the sense that they talk like humans and move around like them a little bit, but they still visually look like regular domestic house cats. One thing to say straight off the bat, this movie is dark and very twisted. In fact, I'd actually go so far as to say it's a contender for the darkest animated film of all time. So be aware as we go into this is going to be a very fucked up movie we're going to be looking at right now. It's also kind of interesting to think that this is a German film because the Germans' history of animation is a bit of an odd one. They don't have a clear path like America, Britain, or even France. They kind of did animation for a period, then stopped, then came back again, then stopped, then came back again. It's very inconsistent. But in that regard, you could regard this movie as sort of like the magnum opus of German animation, at least in terms of films. In terms of TV shows, Farthing Wood probably gets that honour because it was animated in Germany. And actually, this does have some similarities to Farthing Wood in some very vague ways. The plot involves a cat named Francis who considers himself a sort of detective who moves to a new home with his detective noir writer owner and meets some new cats like Bluebeard and Kong and has a good time with them, but soon starts to discover that there's a seedy underbelly to the place he's moved to, and perhaps he's the key to unlocking the secret. So ostensibly, this is a movie that is meant to be like a noir detective story, sort of the kind of thing that you would see a character that would be played by Humphrey Bogart in there. But it's got cats in it, because why not? Although I will admit, despite the odd premise, it does actually utilise it very well. It does establish that the characters are cats and not just cats in place of humans. They do use elements of their species that does actually make sense. In some pretty dark ways, I'll grant you, but it's not like these are supposed to be humans. They do feel like cats. Again, similar to how Farthing Wood established that the characters are meant to be animals and not human placeholders. That's actually quite clever. And the mystery is certainly an intriguing one. I wouldn't say that it's a brilliant mystery because the best mysteries are the kinds where it does keep you on your toes and keep you guessing, but you can have a slight idea about where it's all leading. This one, I had no idea where it was going, which is still a good thing, but you want to have at least some sense of intrigue and a sense of theory about what's going on. Otherwise, you're just going to feel a little bit lost and feel like you're being strung along. But it's still an intriguing mystery, and it definitely leads to some interesting twists at the end, I can tell you that much. The animation is excellent as well. It has a somewhat anime-ish look in terms of its style, but in terms of its motion, it's a lot like Western style animation. Kind of similar to Akira in that regard, or back in the 90s when Asian companies were outsourced to do Western animation for the first time. And it does work really well for this movie because it definitely gives it a very interesting look, but it does really give it a great sense of atmosphere, especially with the use of colours and the somewhat watercolour-esque backgrounds, again similar to Farthing Wood. And the way the characters move, it's that perfect mix between having a human-like kind of characteristic about it, but they still feel like they're the animals that they're supposed to be. And yeah, in terms of that atmosphere, well, the animation does add to that panache, but the dark element of it definitely comes from what happens in it. This movie pulls no punches in being dark, vicious, and violent. We see some really messed up stuff. Decapitations, disembowelings, fetus killing, some really messed up dream sequences with zombie cats, and even a sex scene where it seems like the element of consent is a little bit questionable. This is where a lot of people do tend to split on the movie. Some people loving it just because of how dark it is, and other people saying that it felt rather needless because it doesn't quite fit with the old-fashioned noir mentality it's trying to capture, and it just felt like they were being exploitative. I kind of lean into the middle of that argument because it is very cool and it's very dark, and I do like cool and dark stuff, but yeah, it did feel like it wasn't really necessary. But at the same time, it does help this movie have an identity, because I think without it, it probably would have gone under the radar, but with it, it really helped make it a cult classic that it is. The only thing I will say is that I compared this to Farthing Wood a lot, and the violence in Farthing Wood, while it did also feel a little bit exploitative, it did make sense there, because the idea was that they were trying to emphasize how dangerous the woods are, and how dangerous it is to be a wild animal just out in the open. Here, it didn't really feel like it was necessary. I get that it was trying to give a sense of urgency to why Francis needs to discover what's going on here, but it still felt you could have done that without all the violence, but I didn't really have a problem with it myself. The one thing I did have a problem with was Francis himself, since I just didn't find his character all that interesting. This is meant to be a noir-style detective story, and typically in these kind of stories, the main protagonist, if he is a detective, is normally very grizzled, very sort of misanthropic, and acts like everything he does is just an annoyance to him. Like Humphrey Bogart in some of his movies, but also like Jack Nicholson in Chinatown. And I know that character is a cliche, but there's a reason it's been used so many times, because it really works in context of this story. Hell, even the dude from Big Lebowski was like that, and that is an amazing movie, and it's not even really meant to be a noir, but it really works. Francis has a very sort of wide-eyed, fresh-faced, naive, overly friendly kind of disposition about him, and it didn't really work for me. I get what they were trying to do. They were trying to make him very appealing and soft and approachable in contrast to the very dark stuff that's in the movie, but it just didn't make him very endearing to me. It made him slightly irritating, especially since his voice is very high-pitched and it felt just a little bit grating. It's not a bad characterization, it's just not quite what I was expecting. In fact, in many ways, I think Bluebeard is actually more closer to the way the protagonist should have been, because he's very grizzled, he's very grumpy, he's complaining all the time. He's meant to be the comic relief, so he's not the most intelligent, I'll grant you, but I feel like if they mixed up the characterization between him and Francis a bit more, it would have made it a much better movie. But that's just me, really. But that's really my only complaint about the movie, and I will admit that the plot twist at the end about what is actually going on, I felt a little bit disappointing, but again, that's just me, and I won't say what it is, because if you want to find out yourself, you're welcome to. This is definitely a very ambitious, and in many ways I think mostly successful animated movie. It definitely feels like it was trying to be its own thing. It wasn't trying to follow the trends of the time. This movie came out in the 90s. This is a time when animation was pretty much completely controlled at a dictatorship level by Disney. This is a very un-Disney movie, and I appreciate it for that. In the same way I like Rock and Roll, because it was trying to be something different from what you saw back then. And like Rock and Roll, it does have its flaws, but I think it pulled it off for the most part. So yeah, I definitely recommend this movie. And, well, I'll be honest, even a person like me who hates cats, some of the things that happen to the cats in this movie made even me wince, so bravo there. But join me next time and we'll see what I look at then is a top cat.